She looked at his dirty boots, then at his skin, and decided he didn't belong there. In a luxury hotel lobby built for the powerful, one glance was all it took for a billionaire woman to make a choice. She saw a man in work boots holding his young daughter, and assumed she knew his place. What she didn't know was that this single moment would cost her everything. If you believe moments like this reveal who people really are, stay with this story, because what happened next says more about power than money ever could. The lobby of the Sterling Tower had been designed to feel untouchable. Polished marble floors reflected the light from a ceiling so high it made conversations echo softly, as if even voices were expected to behave. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers and expensive cleaning products, the kind that promised purity without ever being noticed. It was the sort of place where people lowered their tone instinctively, where confidence walked in before the person did. Marcus stood just inside the entrance, his weight shifted slightly to one side as his 5-year-old daughter rested against his leg. Lily's small fingers wrapped around his hand, her other arm clutching a juice box she had insisted on bringing. She swung it absent-mindedly, humming to herself, unaware of the invisible rules governing the room they stood in. Marcus was dressed for a job site, not a boardroom. His boots were scuffed and dusty, the kind of wear that came from use, not neglect. A faded high-visibility vest hung open over a dark shirt, and a rolled tube of blueprints was tucked beneath his arm. Nothing about him was loud. He wasn't loitering, wasn't pacing, wasn't drawing attention. He was simply there, waiting, like he had done 1,000 times before, in places far less forgiving. The revolving doors spun sharply, and Victoria entered like a disruption. She moved fast, heels clicking with purpose, her phone held inches from her face as her thumbs flew across the screen. Her reflection passed briefly through the mirrored columns lining the lobby. Tailored suit, immaculate hair, posture sharpened by years of being obeyed. She didn't look up as she walked, because she had learned the world adjusted itself for people like her, until it didn't. The collision happened near the centre of the lobby. Not dramatic, not violent, just enough. The cup in Victoria's hand tilted. Hot espresso arced through the air and splashed across the marble floor, dark liquid blooming like a stain. It soaked the toe of Marcus's boot and dotted the pristine white of Victoria's designer heel. For a fraction of a second, everything stopped. Victoria gasped, the sound sharp and offended, as if the building itself had betrayed her. She looked down first at the coffee spreading across the floor, then at her shoe. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes travelled upward deliberately, from the boots, to the worn jeans, to the vest, and finally to Marcus's face. That was when the decision was made. Marcus reacted immediately. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice calm, steady. He shifted the blueprints under his arm and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded handkerchief. "Are you hurt?" He crouched slightly, instinctively, careful not to let Lily step into the mess. He reached toward Victoria's shoe, focused on fixing the accident before it became something else. She recoiled as if struck. "Don't touch me!" Victoria snapped, jerking her foot back. The words snapped too, brittle and loud in the quiet lobby. "Are you out of your mind?" Marcus froze, his hand still in the air for a moment before he slowly pulled it back. Lily tightened her grip on his fingers. "I didn't mean to," he began. "You people are unbelievable," Victoria cut in, her voice rising. She straightened, her shock hardening into something sharper. "Do you have any idea how much this costs?" She gestured down at herself as though her clothes were credentials. "This suit is worth more than whatever you make in a year." A few heads turned. Not many. People in places like this were trained to pretend they saw nothing. Marcus stood up fully then, placing himself subtly between Victoria and his daughter. "It was an accident," he said. "You walked into me." Victoria laughed, a short, humourless sound. "Oh, that's rich. You don't belong here, and now you're blaming me?" Her eyes flicked to Lily, lingering just long enough to register her presence. "Dragging a child around like this, honestly." Lily's humming stopped. "This is a place of business," Victoria continued, lowering her voice in a way that made it more cutting, not less. "Not a shelter. If you're here to beg or wander around, take it outside." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation he had learned to recognize and control. He had been in rooms like this before, rooms that decided who mattered, without asking. He had learned long ago when to speak, and when silence was safer. But Lily shifted behind his leg, pressing her face into the back of his knee. "I'm not causing any trouble," Marcus said evenly, "and I'm not leaving." That was when Victoria's expression changed completely. She pulled her phone from her hand like a weapon. "Security," she said sharply, already tapping the screen. "I need someone to remove a man from the lobby, immediately." A security guard near the front desk looked up. He recognized Marcus instantly. His posture stiffened, and he started forward. Marcus met his eyes and shook his head, just once. The guard hesitated. Victoria didn't notice. She was staring at Marcus now, satisfaction creeping into her expression. "You see how this works?" she said. "People like you don't get to decide where they stand." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, as if committing her face to memory. "I'm not the janitor," he said quietly. "And I'm not cleaning up a mess I didn't make." The words landed heavier than he intended. Victoria's mouth fell open slightly, then snapped shut. Colour rose in her cheeks. "Excuse me?" Before Marcus could respond, Lily tugged gently at his hand. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small. "Can we go?" He glanced down at her, then back at Victoria. "Yes," he said, "we can." He turned toward the elevators. Victoria's laugh followed him. "Hey, those are for executives." Marcus didn't turn around. He pressed his palm to the scanner. The light turned green, and as the doors slid open, the murmurs in the lobby grew just a little louder. If you're still watching, you already know this wasn't just a coincidence, and the next few minutes are where everything changes. The elevator doors closed softly behind Marcus and Lily, sealing them inside a quiet that felt almost deliberate. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching his face for answers he wasn't ready to give yet. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. Marcus smiled, gentle and reassuring, the kind of smile that came from practice. "No, baby," he said. "We're right where we're supposed to be." The elevator began its ascent, smooth and silent. Numbers lit up one by one. Marcus loosened his grip on the blueprints just enough to rest his hand on Lily's shoulder. Outside the steel doors, the building returned to its performance of calm luxury. But inside the car, he felt the slow burn of something he had spent years mastering: patience. Downstairs, Victoria was still standing in the lobby, staring at the closed elevator doors, as if they had personally insulted her. The green light above the panel glowed back at her, unbothered by her disbelief. "Did you see that?" she snapped at the nearest security guard. "He just walked into the executive elevator." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, Unacceptable," Victoria said, already moving past him. "Absolutely unacceptable. This building is a joke if anyone can wander around like that." She marched toward the front desk, heels striking the floor in sharp, rhythmic clicks. "I want the owner informed immediately," she demanded. "I'm here for a meeting, and I will not tolerate being harassed by vagrants." The receptionist offered a polite, practiced smile, the kind designed to deflect rather than engage. "Mr. Sterling is aware of all activity in the building, ma'am," Victoria scoffed. "Well, then he should be aware that I was nearly assaulted." The word hung there, heavy and inaccurate. Across the lobby, a few guests exchanged glances. No one spoke. No one challenged her version of events. Silence, Victoria had learned, was usually agreement. She checked her watch and exhaled sharply. She didn't have time for this. Apex Realty's future was balanced on the meeting she was about to walk into. This deal wasn't just another acquisition. It was the acquisition. Sterling Tower was prime, iconic, and symbolic. Owning it would cement her position at the top of the city's real estate hierarchy, and she would not let a nobody in work boots ruin that. By the time Victoria stepped back into the revolving doors and headed for the private elevator bank, her irritation had already transformed into something else: certainty. Certainty that she had handled the situation correctly. Certainty that the world still worked the way it always had for her. High above the city, the penthouse floor waited. The conference room was expansive, its windows stretching from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the skyline. A long mahogany table dominated the space, polished to a mirror shine. Victoria's team was already there. Lawyers, advisors, people whose job it was to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. She took her seat at the head of the table, smoothing her jacket and adjusting her posture. The moment was familiar, comforting. This was where she belonged. "Well," she said, glancing around with a practiced smile, "let's not waste time." One of the board members from Sterling Enterprises, a woman with silver hair and an expression shaped by decades of negotiation, folded her hands calmly. "Mr. Sterling prefers to begin once he's completed his inspection." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Inspection?" "He likes to walk the building himself," the woman replied. "Ensures everything aligns with his standards." Victoria laughed lightly, the sound echoing just enough to assert dominance. "That's quaint." She leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other. "I just came from the lobby," she added casually. "You really should tighten security down there. Anyone can walk in." The board members exchanged subtle looks. "I had an incident," Victoria continued, waving a dismissive hand. "Some construction worker spilled coffee on me. Had his kid with him. Very unprofessional." No one responded immediately. "I handled it," she said, pleased with herself. "But still, first impressions matter. If you've ever watched someone mistake confidence for immunity, you already feel where this is going." The doors at the far end of the room clicked softly. Victoria straightened, her smile sharpening. "Ah, finally!" She stood, ready to greet the man she expected. Older, polished, familiar. Someone who would recognize her value instantly. The door opened, and Marcus walked in. He no longer wore the high-visibility vest. It hung folded over his arm now. The rest of him was unchanged, boots still dusty, jeans still worn. Lily sat perched on his hip, her juice box replaced with a small colouring book. The room went still. Marcus met the board's gaze first. Several of them stood immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," they said. Victoria didn't sit down. She didn't breathe. Her eyes darted from Marcus to the board members and back again, her mind scrambling for an explanation that refused to form. "This," she said slowly, forcing a laugh that sounded thin even to her own ears. "This isn't funny." Marcus stepped further into the room, calm and unhurried. He set Lily down gently in the chair beside him, and handed her a crayon. "Give Daddy a minute," he said softly. Then he turned to Victoria and smiled. The contract sat on the table between them, thick and final. Marcus rested his hand on it, and that was when Victoria understood, far too late, that the choice she made in the lobby had followed her upstairs. If you think power only shows itself when people know who you are, stay with this, because the next moment changes everything. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed again. No sound came out. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. "This is inappropriate," she finally said, her voice tight, brittle. "I don't know who you think you are, but this meeting—" Marcus lifted a hand, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to stop her. The gesture was subtle. The effect was immediate. The board members remained standing. No one corrected him. No one looked at her. Marcus glanced down at Lily, who was already colouring with quiet concentration, blissfully unaware of the shift in gravity happening around her. He waited a beat longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch. He had learned that silence, when used correctly, could say far more than words. Then he looked back at Victoria. "Please," he said calmly, "have a seat." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Victoria didn't move. Her knees felt locked, her body refusing to obey her mind. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had run this meeting 100 times in her head. Controlled, dominant, inevitable. Now the script was gone, replaced by a reality she didn't recognize. One of her lawyers cleared his throat softly. "Victoria," he murmured, not quite meeting her eyes. She sat. The chair felt colder than it had moments ago. Marcus took his place at the head of the table, across from her, the contract still beneath his hand. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Instead, he studied her, the way an engineer studies a structure, patiently, methodically, already aware of where the stress fractures lived. "I understand you had an interaction downstairs," he said. Victoria swallowed. Yes, there was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Marcus repeated, his voice even. "Yes," she said quickly, relief rushing in at the word. "That's all it was. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize who I was," Marcus finished for her. The board members shifted slightly, uncomfortable. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "But you realized plenty." Victoria's heart began to pound. She felt the eyes of her own team on her now, not supportive, not protective, calculating, measuring distance. "If this story feels uncomfortably familiar," Marcus continued, "it's because it happens every day. People decide who deserves respect long before introductions are made." Victoria forced a smile, thin and strained. "Mr. Sterling, I assure you, Apex Realty values diversity. I personally—" Marcus held up a finger. Downstairs, she had pointed at him the same way. The realization hit her like a delayed impact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. He simply watched as her composure began to crack under the weight of her own words, replaying in her mind. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched endlessly, unaware that a deal worth millions was quietly unraveling. Marcus glanced once more at Lily, then back at Victoria. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want to be very clear about something." The room leaned in with him. "What happens next," Marcus said, "has nothing to do with revenge. It has everything to do with standards." Victoria's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "And I have very high standards for who I allow to build on what I've spent my life creating." He reached for the contract. Victoria's breath caught. If you're still here, don't look away now, because the next decision will determine who walks out of this room with everything and who leaves with nothing." Marcus opened the folder. Marcus's hand hovered over the contract for a heartbeat longer than anyone expected. The room held its collective breath, as though even the walls were waiting for him to make the first move. Victoria's chest tightened, a cold awareness settling over her. This wasn't just about a document, a deal, or a lobby confrontation anymore. This was a reckoning. She had misjudged the man in front of her, the one she had dismissed, mocked, and tried to control. Every instinct in her body told her to speak, to justify, to explain, but she found her voice trapped somewhere between fear and disbelief. Marcus's gaze swept over the table, finally resting on her, not with anger, not with malice, but with a calm that felt far more dangerous. He could have torn her down with words, with authority, with evidence of her misstep, but he didn't. He simply held the power in his silence, the kind of quiet that made you question your own assumptions. "You understand why you're here," he said softly, his voice measured, controlled. It carried authority without aggression, but each word landed like the click of a lock sealing a door. "And I understand why you think you're in control. But control, real control, comes from respect, not fear, not entitlement, not assumptions." Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her team shifted in their chairs, exchanging uneasy glances. Even seasoned lawyers, accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, were momentarily paralyzed by the shift in energy. The room, usually a place of corporate certainty, had become a theatre where every gesture, every glance carried weight. Lily, sitting quietly with her colouring book, barely looked up. Marcus glanced at her briefly, a soft smile touching his lips, before returning his attention to Victoria. "It's remarkable," he continued, "how quickly people make judgments based on appearances. Boots, clothes, a child at your side. These should never determine how someone is treated. Yet here we are." Victoria's cheeks burned, the heat of embarrassment mixing with indignation. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation, to reclaim some semblance of authority. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best effort to appear composed, "this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know—" "Exactly," Marcus interrupted, calm but firm. "You didn't know. You assumed. And assumptions, especially when wielded as judgment, can have consequences." There was a quiet click from the board members, subtle but unmistakable, a small acknowledgement of agreement without overt confrontation. Victoria's gaze darted around the room, searching for support, and found none. Her own team avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with her unravelling. The contract remained untouched, a silent symbol of the power she had thought she commanded. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "Business," he said, "is built on trust, on understanding, and on recognition of value. Not only monetary, but human. You've displayed none of that in your approach today." Victoria's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, her knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth again, ready to defend, ready to argue, but Marcus's calm gaze stopped her before a single word could leave her lips. His composure was disarming, and it made her own agitation feel exposed. At that moment, the subtle power of storytelling, the invisible tension that had been building since the lobby, reached its peak. Every choice she had made, every snide remark, every judgmental glance echoed back at her in the silence of the room. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a revelation. If you've ever been in a situation where your assumptions came back to confront you, pause for a second and think about the weight of that realization. Moments like these define character. They don't need drama or spectacle. They need clarity and consequence. And Victoria was learning that lesson the hard way. Marcus finally picked up the contract, running a hand over its surface. The sound was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it felt like thunder to Victoria. He looked at her again, and this time there was a glint in his eyes, a mix of calm calculation and firm resolve. "I'm going to give you a choice," he said. "One chance to proceed correctly, to demonstrate that respect and awareness are not just words, but this will not be repeated. The next step will determine everything." The weight of his words settled over Victoria. She understood instinctively that this wasn't an idle warning. This was a defining moment. Every fibre of her being urged her to respond with charm, with persuasion, with the usual arsenal she wielded so effortlessly in boardrooms across the city. Yet none of it seemed appropriate. Not now, not here. She swallowed, trying to regain her composure. "And what," she managed, voice tighter than intended, "would you have me do?" Marcus allowed himself a small nod of approval, almost imperceptible. Sit, listen, learn, and recognize what it takes to hold power without abusing it. That is the first step. Victoria hesitated. The hum of the city outside the massive windows filled the silence, grounding her in the reality she had been ignoring. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair, feeling the chill of the leather against her skin, a physical reminder that she was no longer the one dictating terms. The board members relaxed slightly, though their attention remained fixed on the interaction between Victoria and Marcus. Even they understood the subtle shifts taking place, the unravelling of authority, the emergence of a higher standard, the quiet demonstration of integrity that spoke louder than any contract or verbal assertion. Marcus leaned back, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "I am giving you the benefit of my time and my patience," he said, his tone steady, unwavering. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. The choices you make from this point forward will define not only your outcome in this deal, but your credibility in every room you ever enter." Victoria nodded quickly, swallowing hard, her mind racing for a way to regain control, to re-establish dominance, to salvage even a fragment of dignity. But deep down, she knew that this was no longer about clever arguments or corporate maneuvering. This was about recognition. Recognition of value, recognition of respect, recognition of the consequences of her earlier misjudgment. As Marcus set the contract back on the table, a gentle pause followed. Lily shifted in her seat, glancing up at him with a small smile, unaware of the tension that hung thickly in the room. Her innocence was a silent counterpoint to the gravity of the moment, a reminder of the stakes that extended far beyond money or status. And then, with deliberate calm, Marcus began to outline the expectations for the remainder of the meeting. Not with threats, not with indignation, but with clarity. Every word, every gesture carried authority without arrogance. Victoria listened, realizing for the first time that the true power in this room did not come from wealth or title, but from presence, integrity, and the ability to command respect through action rather than assumption. As the discussion continued, subtle yet unmistakable tension filled the air. Victoria knew that one misstep, one improper word, could undo everything she had worked for. The board watched, aware that they were witnessing more than a negotiation. They were observing a lesson, quietly but unmistakably delivered. At that moment, the quiet authority Marcus wielded became almost palpable. It was a presence that filled the room without effort, a demonstration that power, when paired with discernment, can be far more persuasive than any shouted argument or aggressive maneuver. And in the back of her mind, Victoria felt the creeping awareness that the events of the lobby, her misjudgment, her assumptions, her hubris, were no longer distant. They had followed her here, and they would define every interaction from this point onward. If you've ever wondered how one moment of misjudgment can ripple through an entire narrative, this is it. Pay attention, because the next turn will change everything, and Victoria's next move will determine whether she survives this encounter, or becomes a cautionary tale. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she watched Marcus stand, his presence commanding yet calm, every movement precise, deliberate. The contract remained untouched, a silent testament to the choice that now lay before her. She understood, in a way that no boardroom lecture or corporate seminar could have ever taught, that this was no ordinary negotiation. Every glance, every gesture, every word spoken or unspoken carried weight far greater than the millions inked on paper. She swallowed, her throat dry, as Marcus moved with quiet assurance toward the window, looking out over the city he had helped shape from the ground up. Lily perched quietly on his hip, content, unaware of the magnitude of the moment. It was a juxtaposition that stung, a child's innocence against a woman's ambition, against the subtle but undeniable authority of a man she had misjudged in seconds. Victoria felt the walls of her confidence closing in. Every polished argument she had prepared, every strategy rehearsed, every charm she wielded so effortlessly, none of it applied here. This was different. This was personal, in a way that the sterile language of contracts and boardrooms had never accounted for. She could sense the shift in the air, the quiet recalibration of power that was happening right in front of her. Marcus turned slowly, meeting her gaze with an intensity that was steady, unflinching. "You see," he said softly, yet each word carried weight that resonated in the room. "Respect cannot be commanded. It can only be earned. And assumptions, when left unchecked, have consequences." Victoria's chest tightened. She had underestimated him. She had assumed arrogantly that appearances defined reality. She had been wrong. And the realization hit her with the force of a lesson long overdue. Lily's small hand reached out to brush against Marcus's shoulder, and the simple, quiet gesture underscored the truth Victoria could not deny. This man was more than what she had presumed. He was a father, a creator, and the one who set the standards in his own domain. She, for all her power and wealth, was an intruder in a narrative she had thought she controlled. The board members remained silent, their eyes trained on the interaction with subtle reverence. No one moved, no one interrupted. Even Victoria's own advisers seemed to understand instinctively that the next steps were not for them to influence. Marcus's gaze softened slightly, resting on Lily, and then he shifted his attention back to Victoria. "Your assumptions," he said, "have consequences. Not because I wield power over you, but because you failed to recognize the basic principle of respect. And now, everything depends on how you respond to what you've done." Victoria's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white, mind racing for a strategy that could salvage her pride, her deal, her reputation. She had expected confrontation, negotiation, persuasion, but none of the usual tools applied here. She was navigating uncharted territory, and the path forward was perilously narrow. The quiet settled over the room, thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves waited for the next move. Every second stretched, elongated by the weight of realization, the gravity of misjudgment, the subtle authority of a man who had been underestimated from the start. And then Marcus took a deliberate step forward, placing his hand firmly on the contract. The sound, though soft, echoed with significance. Victoria's pulse quickened. This was the moment. Every decision she made next would determine the outcome, not just of the deal, but of her standing, her pride, and the quiet judgment of everyone present. She met his gaze, searching for a flaw, a hesitation, a clue to exploit, but found none. He was calm, composed, and entirely in control. And in that instant, Victoria realized, with a sinking certainty, that the events in the lobby were only the beginning. The choices she made now would follow her long after this room emptied, long after the ink dried on any contract, long after she thought she had regained control. The room held its breath. The silence in the penthouse conference room was profound, heavy with the tension of unspoken truths. Victoria's eyes darted around, searching for some anchor, some reassurance that the world still operated under the rules she knew. But the reality confronting her was unyielding. Marcus, the man she had dismissed, mocked, and insulted only moments ago, held the kind of authority that could not be argued with, charmed, or coerced. He had not raised his voice, he had not threatened, and yet the weight of his presence was more commanding than any blustered demand she had ever issued in her career. Lily, sitting quietly in her chair, turned the page of her colouring book, blissfully innocent to the high-stakes drama unfolding around her. The contrast between childlike simplicity and the crushing complexity of adult consequence only highlighted the gravity of Victoria's miscalculation. She had assumed that status, wealth, and the polished image she projected would dictate outcomes. She had been wrong. Marcus's eyes met hers once more, steady, deliberate, unwavering. "You made an assumption," he said softly, though the room hung on each word, "that appearances define reality. That judgment can be passed in an instant without understanding, without context, without regard for human dignity. And in that assumption, you revealed more about your character than I could ever need to know." Victoria's fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, her mind racing for any possible rebuttal, any way to salvage the situation. But words faltered. Every instinct she had relied on in negotiations, in business deals, in life itself, was suddenly irrelevant. This was no longer a boardroom strategy. It was a mirror held up to the choices she had made, the biases she had acted on, and the consequences she had dismissed. Marcus leaned slightly forward, resting one hand on the polished surface of the table, the other lightly brushing against the edge of the contract. "You see, respect cannot be commanded. It cannot be bought. It cannot be assumed. It is demonstrated, and it is earned in every interaction, in every decision, in every acknowledgement of the people around you." Victoria swallowed hard, realizing the depth of the trap she had walked into. The lobby incident, the coffee spilled, the harsh words spoken, they were no longer isolated events. They were the foundation upon which the outcome of this deal and her professional standing now rested. And it was a foundation she had fractured with her own hands. A subtle shift occurred in the board members' posture, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that Marcus's authority extended beyond title, wealth, or corporate protocol. They had witnessed countless negotiations, countless power plays, yet this was different. This was a demonstration of true control, measured, deliberate, and grounded in integrity. Marcus's gaze softened briefly as he looked at Lily. "Daddy's work requires patience," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and understanding, just as your work requires acknowledgement of responsibility." Then he turned back to Victoria, and with a calm finality he placed the contract in front of her. The inked pages seemed heavier than any paper should, laden with the consequence of her earlier misjudgment. "You may review it," he said, "but know this. The terms of engagement are no longer determined by assumptions, by appearances, or by arrogance. they are determined by respect, by comprehension, and by the willingness to acknowledge the value of those you encounter. Victoria's hands hovered above the document, hesitant, trembling. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She could not win here by her old tactics. She could not manipulate, charm, or assert dominance. The only power she had left was choice, the choice to learn, to accept, to move forward with humility, or to reject the lesson and face the consequences she had already set in motion. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, a sound of resignation mixed with disbelief. The room remained quiet, the hum of the city outside a distant echo to the gravity inside. Marcus's presence was a reminder that life's true currency was not wealth, not title, not influence, but the treatment of others and the integrity of one's actions. Victoria's gaze flicked to Lily, colouring innocently, and then back to Marcus. The subtle power of the father she had mocked became undeniable, a reality she could no longer evade. The arrogance that had once propelled her forward now anchored her in a humbling truth. Her misjudgment had consequences, and Marcus had demonstrated, without fury or spectacle, the cost of her assumptions. In a final, unspoken acknowledgement of her position, Victoria slid the contract back across the table without signing. The board members did not comment. Marcus nodded once, a subtle but unmistakable signal that the lesson had been understood, the boundary established. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing just enough to mark the end of the confrontation. Lily reached for a crayon, smiling up at Marcus, who returned the gesture with warmth. In that simple, quiet moment, the contrast was undeniable. A child's innocence, a father's steady hand, and the quiet, unassailable authority that came not from status, but from integrity. Victoria, for all her wealth and ambition, gathered her belongings in stunned silence. She left the room without another word, aware that the lesson extended far beyond the walls of Stirling Tower. As the doors closed behind her, the city continued its indifferent hum, unaware that a small yet significant reckoning had taken place. The events of the lobby, the assumptions, the judgments, they had followed her upstairs and left their mark. Marcus returned to the contract, Lily at his side, a reminder that life's true measure is found not in material accumulation, but in character, in patience, and in the respect given to those who can teach us more than any boardroom ever could. If you've watched this story unfold and felt the weight of assumptions, of judgments, and of consequences, take a moment to reflect. Moments of respect, or the lack thereof, echo far beyond the immediate, and the smallest actions, the briefest interactions, can define outcomes in ways you never anticipated. Because in the end, Marcus continued building, Lily continued colouring, and the lesson Victoria carried with her was indelible. Power without respect is fragile, assumptions are costly, and integrity always outlasts arrogance. If this story reminded you of the importance of treating everyone with dignity, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, kindness costs nothing but shapes everything.